The morning sun was barely peeking through London's grey clouds when David stepped off the plane at Heathrow Airport. His eyes were red and tired from the 11-hour flight that should have been 9 hours. The airline had delayed his departure twice, and now his carefully planned vacation was already falling apart. David was 28 years old and worked for a tech company back in Seattle. He had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was his first real vacation in 3 years, and he had saved every penny to make it perfect. But nothing was going according to plan. First, his luggage got lost somewhere between Seattle and London. The airline staff just shrugged and said it might show up in a day or two. Maybe. Then he found out that his hotel reservation had been canceled due to a computer error. The apologetic receptionist offered him a tiny room that cost twice as much as what he had originally booked. By the time David made it to his overpriced hotel room, he was running on 4 hours of sleep and pure frustration. His body clock was completely messed up. It felt like midnight to him, but the clock on the wall said it was morning in London. He tried to sleep but couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind raced with all the things that had gone wrong. The lost luggage, the hotel mix-up, the extra money he was now spending. His perfect vacation was turning into a disaster, and he hadn't even started sightseeing yet. Around 7 in the morning, David gave up on sleep. He took a cold shower because the hot water wasn't working properly, then headed out to grab some coffee. The streets of London were already busy with people rushing to work. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going, while David felt completely lost. He found a small coffee shop near his hotel and ordered the strongest drink they had. The barista, a friendly young woman with a Scottish accent, could see he looked terrible. She asked if he was all right, and David found himself telling her about his awful night. She listened patiently and gave him an extra shot of espresso for free. "First time in London?" she asked with a sympathetic smile. "Yeah, and probably the last," David replied, taking a big gulp of the hot coffee. The coffee helped a little, but David still felt angry at the world. Everything in London seemed so expensive. The taxi from the airport had cost him a fortune. His hotel room was the size of a closet. Even this simple cup of coffee cost more than he would pay back home. With his coffee in hand, David decided to do some sightseeing. He figured that seeing some famous landmarks might improve his mood. Buckingham Palace was only a short walk away, so he headed in that direction. Maybe seeing where the Queen lived would make this trip worthwhile after all. The palace was impressive, David had to admit. The golden gates gleamed in the morning sunlight, and tourists were already gathering to take photos. But what caught David's attention were the guards standing perfectly still in front of the palace. These weren't ordinary security guards. They were the famous royal guards that David had seen in movies and tourist brochures. They wore bright red coats and tall black fuzzy hats that made them look like toy soldiers. But these weren't toys. These were real soldiers, standing at perfect attention, staring straight ahead without moving a muscle. David watched them for a few minutes, sipping his coffee. A group of tourists nearby were trying to make the guards react. They waved at them, made funny faces, even told jokes right in front of their faces. But the guards didn't move. They didn't smile. They didn't even blink. At first, David found it impressive. These guys had incredible discipline. But as he watched longer, something about their stillness started to annoy him. Here he was, having the worst day of his vacation, spending money he didn't have, dealing with one problem after another. And these guards were just standing there like statues, pretending the world didn't exist. A little kid, maybe 5 years old, ran up to one of the guards and started jumping up and down in front of him. The kid was trying so hard to get the guard's attention, waving his little hands and making silly noises. But the guard acted like the child wasn't even there. He stared straight ahead with a blank expression, completely ignoring the excited kid. David felt his irritation growing. What was so special about these guys anyway? They were just standing there doing nothing while real people with real problems walked by. They acted like they were too important to acknowledge other human beings. Like they were above everyone else. The more David watched, the angrier he got. His lack of sleep, his frustration with the trip, and his general bad mood all started to focus on these motionless guards. In his tired mind, they became symbols of everything that was wrong with his vacation. They represented the snobbish attitude he felt he was getting from everyone in this expensive city. His friend Jake, who had been taking photos nearby, walked over to where David was standing. Jake had flown in from New York and seemed to be having a much better time. His luggage hadn't been lost and his hotel reservation had worked perfectly. "These guards are pretty cool, right?" Jake said, snapping another photo with his phone. David took another sip of his coffee and shook his head. "I think they're ridiculous," he muttered. "Standing there like they're so much better than everyone else." Jake laughed. "Dude, they're just doing their job. It's like a tradition or whatever." But David wasn't in the mood to appreciate traditions. He was in the mood to take his frustrations out on someone, and these silent guards seemed like the perfect target. They couldn't fight back. They couldn't argue with him. They couldn't make his day any worse than it already was. As David stood there in the morning sun, holding his cooling coffee and staring at the motionless guards, a dangerous idea began to form in his tired, frustrated mind. The crowd around Buckingham Palace was getting bigger as more tourists arrived for the morning. David watched families posing for photos with the guards in the background. Everyone seemed fascinated by these silent soldiers who refused to react to anything. A group of teenagers from Germany were taking turns standing next to one guard, making silly poses while their friend took pictures. The guard didn't even glance at them. He kept staring straight ahead like they were invisible. The teenagers thought this was hilarious and kept trying more ridiculous poses. David felt his jaw clench as he watched. The hot coffee in his hand was still steaming, and the caffeine was making his heart race. Combined with his lack of sleep and mounting frustration, he was like a pressure cooker ready to explode. "Look at them," David said to Jake, nodding toward the guards. "They think they're so special. Like they're too good to even acknowledge that other people exist." Jake was busy adjusting his camera settings. "I think it's kind of impressive, actually. Must take a lot of training to stand that still." But David wasn't listening anymore. His tired brain was fixated on what he saw as the arrogance of these guards. Here he was, a paying tourist who had spent thousands of dollars to visit this country, and these soldiers were treating him and everyone else like they didn't matter. An elderly woman with a walker approached one of the guards. She moved slowly, clearly having difficulty walking. When she got close, she smiled at the guard and said, "Good morning, young man. Thank you for your service." The guard said nothing. He didn't even look down at her. The old woman stood there for a moment, probably hoping for some small acknowledgement of her kind words. But the guard remained frozen like a statue. Finally, she shook her head sadly and walked away. That was the moment something snapped inside David's exhausted mind. This wasn't about discipline or tradition anymore. This was just rude. That sweet old lady had shown respect and gratitude, and the guard had completely ignored her. If he couldn't even acknowledge a polite grandmother, then he deserved whatever was coming to him. David's grip tightened on his coffee cup. The liquid inside was still hot enough to burn his tongue when he sipped it. Hot enough to get a reaction from someone who thought he was too cool to respond to anything. "I bet I could make him move," David said quietly, more to himself than to Jake. "What?" Jake looked up from his camera. "These guys," David said, his voice getting louder. "They act like nothing can touch them. Like they're robots or something. But they're not robots. They're just regular people in fancy costumes." A family from Australia overheard David and laughed. "Yeah, we've been trying to get a reaction out of them for 10 minutes, the father said. "It's like they're not even human." That comment struck something in David's foggy brain. Not even human. Maybe that's how they wanted to be treated. Maybe someone needed to remind them that they were just people, not living statues. David took a step closer to the nearest guard. This one looked young, maybe in his early 20s. He had a serious expression and was staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. His red uniform was perfectly clean and pressed. His tall black hat sat at the exact right angle. Everything about him screamed military precision. "Hey," David said loudly, standing right in front of the guard. "I'm talking to you." The guard didn't react. He didn't even blink. It was like David wasn't there at all. "I said I'm talking to you," David repeated, his voice rising. A few tourists nearby started to notice the commotion. Still nothing. The guard might as well have been made of stone. David felt heat rushing to his face. The lack of sleep, the ruined vacation, the expensive hotel, the lost luggage. All of his frustrations were now focused on this one silent figure in front of him. This guard who thought he was too good to even acknowledge David's existence. "You think you're better than everyone else?" David shouted. More people were turning to look now. Some were pulling out their phones, sensing that something was about to happen. Jake noticed the growing attention and tried to intervene. "Hey man, maybe we should just go grab some breakfast or something." But David was beyond reasoning now. The combination of exhaustion and caffeine had pushed him past his breaking point. In his sleep-deprived state, the guard's silence felt like a personal insult. Like this stranger in a fancy uniform was deliberately disrespecting him. David looked down at the hot coffee in his hand. Then he looked back up at the guard's face. The guard's eyes were focused on something far in the distance, completely ignoring the angry tourist just feet away from him. "You know what?" David said, his voice suddenly quiet and dangerous. "I've had enough of this attitude." A small voice in the back of David's mind tried to warn him that he was about to make a terrible mistake, that he was tired and angry and not thinking clearly, that throwing coffee at a soldier was probably illegal and definitely stupid. But that small voice was drowned out by the roar of his frustration and the buzz of too much caffeine on an empty stomach. David raised his hand, the coffee cup trembling slightly as his adrenaline surged. "Watch this," he said to Jake, who was now looking alarmed. "I'll get him to react." Several tourists nearby sensed what was about to happen and started recording with their phones. In the age of social media, everyone wanted to capture dramatic moments. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would change David's life forever. David pulled his arm back, the hot coffee sloshing in the cup. The guard continued to stare straight ahead, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. In that final second before everything went wrong, David made a choice that he would regret for the rest of his life. The coffee left David's hand in what felt like slow motion. The white paper cup tumbled through the air, hot brown liquid spilling out in an arc toward the unsuspecting guard. For a split second, David felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Finally, he was going to get a reaction from this arrogant soldier who thought he was too good for regular people. But that feeling lasted only a heartbeat. The scalding coffee hit the guard square in the face with a splash that echoed off the palace walls. The hot liquid soaked through his red uniform and ran down his neck. Steam rose from his skin where the coffee had made contact. The smell of burnt skin mixed with the aroma of coffee filled the morning air. The guard's eyes widened in shock and pain. For just a moment, his perfect military composure cracked. His face twisted in agony as the hot liquid burned his skin. But even through the obvious pain, he fought to maintain his position. His training kicked in, and he forced himself to remain at attention even as coffee dripped from his face onto his pristine uniform. The crowd around them fell completely silent. Phones that had been recording expecting a funny tourist moment were now capturing something much more serious. Children who had been laughing and playing suddenly went quiet, sensing that something terrible had just happened. David stood frozen, the empty coffee cup still in his hand. The reality of what he had just done was starting to sink in. This wasn't a movie or a video game. He had just thrown boiling hot coffee at a real person, a person who was now clearly in pain because of David's actions. The guard's jaw was clenched tight, and David could see him fighting back tears of pain. Small red marks were already appearing on his face where the coffee had hit him, but incredibly the soldier was still trying to do his job. He was still standing at attention, still staring straight ahead, even though coffee was dripping from his uniform and he was obviously hurt. "Oh my God," someone in the crowd whispered. "He actually did it." Jake dropped his camera and grabbed David's arm. "Dude, what did you just do?" His voice was filled with horror and disbelief. David opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. His brain was finally catching up to his actions. The anger and frustration that had driven him to throw the coffee were evaporating, replaced by a cold realization of how badly he had messed up. A woman in the crowd was already dialing emergency services. "Yes, I need to report an assault at Buckingham Palace," she said into her phone, her voice shaking. Someone just attacked one of the guards with hot coffee. Other tourists were backing away from David like he was dangerous. Parents pulled their children closer. The festive morning atmosphere around the palace had completely changed. Everyone was staring at David with expressions of shock and disgust. The guard, meanwhile, was still trying to maintain his post despite the obvious pain. Coffee continued to drip from his face, and David could see that his skin was turning red where the hot liquid had hit him. The soldier's hands, which should have remained perfectly still at his sides, were trembling slightly from the shock and pain. "Someone help him," a tourist shouted. "Can't you see he's hurt?" But the guard's training was so complete that he wouldn't break his position. even for medical attention. He had been taught that no matter what happened, no matter what distractions or disruptions occurred, he must remain at his post. Even with coffee burning his skin, he was trying to follow those orders. David finally found his voice. "I'm sorry," he said weakly, but his words were lost in the growing commotion around them. More people were pulling out their phones to record the aftermath. Some were taking pictures of the injured guard. Others were focusing on David, documenting the face of the person who had committed this shocking act. The sound of sirens was already growing louder in the distance. Someone had called the police, and they were responding quickly. David looked around desperately, as if just now realizing that there would be consequences for what he had done. "We should go," Jake said urgently, tugging on David's sleeve. "We need to get out of here before the police arrive." But David couldn't move. He was transfixed by the sight of the guard, who was still standing perfectly still, despite the coffee continuing to drip from his burned face. The soldier's dedication to his duty, even while injured, made David feel even worse about what he had done. A palace official in a dark suit was now approaching the guard, speaking to him in low, urgent tones. The guard nodded slightly, the first movement he had made since being attacked. Steam was still rising from his face and uniform where the hot coffee had soaked in. The crowd was getting bigger as more people heard about what had happened. Tourists who had been visiting other parts of the palace area were walking over to see what the commotion was about. Word was spreading quickly that someone had actually attacked one of the famous royal guards. David could hear people talking about him in disgusted tones. What kind of person does something like that? Those poor guards are just doing their job. That's assault, isn't it? Someone should arrest that guy. The sirens were getting closer. David could see blue flashing lights reflecting off the palace walls. His hands were shaking as the full weight of his actions began to hit him. This wasn't just a stupid prank anymore. He had seriously hurt someone. The guard's face was getting redder, and it was clear that the coffee had caused real burns. A sergeant in a similar uniform appeared beside the injured guard. After a brief, quiet conversation, he gestured for the hurt soldier to step away from his post. Finally, the guard allowed himself to break his rigid stance. As soon as he relaxed, it was obvious how much pain he was in. He raised his hand to his face, wincing as he touched the burned skin. Medical personnel who had been stationed nearby came running with a first aid kit. They immediately began treating the guard's burns, applying cool water to his face and neck. The guard accepted their help gratefully, finally allowing himself to show the pain he had been hiding. David watched this scene with growing horror. What had seemed like a way to prove a point just minutes ago now looked like exactly what it was. A cruel attack on an innocent person who had done nothing wrong except stand quietly at his post. The police cars were pulling up to the palace gates now. Officers in high-visibility vests were jumping out and scanning the crowd, looking for the person who had committed this assault. It wouldn't be hard to find him. Dozens of people were pointing in David's direction, and multiple phone cameras had recorded everything. As the police officers walked toward him with determined expressions, David realized that his vacation was officially over, but that was the least of his problems now. The first police officer to reach David was a tall woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. She looked like she had dealt with plenty of tourist incidents before, but nothing quite like this. "Sir, I need you to put your hands where I can see them," she said in a firm voice that cut through the crowd noise. David's brain was still trying to catch up with reality. Everything seemed to be happening too fast. Just 5 minutes ago, he had been a regular tourist with a bad attitude. Now he was being treated like a criminal, and he was starting to understand why. I didn't mean," David started to say, but the officer cut him off. "Hands up, please. Now." David slowly raised his hands, the empty coffee cup still dangling from his fingers. The officer took it from him and handed it to her partner, who immediately placed it in an evidence bag. Even David's trash was now evidence in a criminal case. More officers were arriving by the second. Some were questioning witnesses in the crowd while others were setting up a perimeter around the scene. David could see that this was being treated as a serious incident, not just a tourist prank gone wrong. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the officer instructed. As David complied, he caught sight of the injured guard being led away by medical personnel. The soldier's face was bright red where the coffee had hit him, and he was clearly in significant pain. But even as he walked away for medical treatment, he maintained his military bearing. His back was straight, his steps were measured, and he carried himself with dignity despite what had just happened to him. The sight made David's stomach turn. This wasn't some faceless authority figure he had lashed out at. This was a real person, probably not much younger than David himself, who had been doing his job when David decided to hurt him for no good reason. The cold metal handcuffs clicked around David's wrists. The sound was surprisingly loud, and it made everything feel suddenly very real. These weren't the plastic toy handcuffs from a costume store. These were the real thing, and they meant that David was now officially under arrest. "You are under arrest on suspicion of assault," the officer said in a clear professional voice. "You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." David had heard these words in movies and TV shows countless times, but hearing them directed at him was completely different. Each word hit him like a physical blow. Assault, court, evidence. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were his new reality. Jake was standing nearby looking absolutely stunned. "David, what were you thinking?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. But David couldn't answer. The officer was guiding him toward a waiting police car, her hand firmly on his arm. The crowd of tourists parted as they walked through, everyone staring at David like he was some kind of monster. A little girl, probably the same age as the child who had been trying to get the guard's attention earlier, pointed at David and asked her mother in a loud voice, "Why did that man hurt the soldier?" Her mother quickly pulled her away, but not before giving David a look of pure disgust. David realized that in the eyes of everyone watching, he wasn't a frustrated tourist who had made a mistake. He was the bad guy who had attacked an innocent person for no reason. As they approached the police car, David could see more emergency vehicles arriving. An ambulance pulled up near the palace entrance, and paramedics jumped out with medical equipment. Even though the guard was already being treated, they were taking his injuries seriously. "Is he going to be okay?" David asked the officer, nodding toward where the guard had been taken. "That's not your concern right now," she replied curtly. "Your concern should be understanding the serious nature of what you've done." The officer opened the back door of the police car. David had never been in the back of a police car before. The seats were hard plastic, and there was a metal barrier separating the back from the front. It smelled like disinfectant and fear. As David sat down, he could feel the handcuffs cutting into his wrists. The officer closed the door with a solid thunk that seemed to seal his fate. Through the window, he could see Jake talking frantically to another officer, probably trying to explain that David wasn't normally like this. But how could Jake explain something that David himself didn't understand? Why had he thrown that coffee? What had he been thinking? The more David tried to remember his reasoning, the more foolish it seemed. The driver, a middle-aged officer with graying hair, looked at David in the rearview mirror. "First time in London?" he asked, not unkindly. "Yeah," David replied quietly. "Well, you've certainly made an impression," the officer said. Attacking a royal guard isn't exactly typical tourist behavior. As the police car pulled away from Buckingham Palace, David looked back through the rear window. The crowd was still gathered around the spot where the incident had occurred. People were pointing and talking animatedly, probably sharing their own versions of what they had witnessed. He could see palace officials working to restore order and get the remaining guards back to their normal positions. A maintenance worker was already cleaning coffee stains from the ground where David had stood. It was like the palace was trying to erase all evidence of his stupid moment. But David knew it was too late for that. The police car drove through the streets of London, past all the tourist attractions David had planned to visit. The Tower of London, Big Ben, Westminster Abbey, all the places he had dreamed of seeing were still there, but now he would probably never get to see them. Instead of vacation photos, he would have a criminal record. His phone was buzzing in his pocket, probably with messages from family and friends back home who had no idea what had just happened. In a few hours, they would know. Everyone would know. This wasn't the kind of thing that stayed secret. "Where are we going?" David asked. "Charing Cross Police Station," the driver replied. "You'll be processed there, and then we'll see what charges you're facing." Charges. The word sent a chill through David. He was going to be charged with a crime. He was going to have to call his parents and his employer and somehow explain what he had done. He was going to need a lawyer. He might have to go to court, all because he had thrown a cup of coffee at someone who was just doing their job. As the police car continued through the London traffic, David closed his eyes and tried to figure out how his life had gone so wrong so quickly. Just this morning, his biggest problem had been lost luggage and an expensive hotel room. Now his biggest problem was that he had become the kind of person who attacks innocent people when he's having a bad day. The sirens of the ambulance carrying the injured guard faded into the distance behind them, but David knew the sound would stay with him forever. It was the sound of his old life disappearing and his new reality beginning. The Charing Cross police station was nothing like the police stations David had seen in movies. It was bright and modern, with white walls and efficient-looking officers moving purposefully through the hallways. But despite the clean appearance, there was an unmistakable atmosphere of serious business being conducted. David was led to a processing area where an officer behind a desk began asking him basic questions. Name, address, date of birth, occupation. Each answer was typed into a computer system that would now forever contain David's information as someone who had been arrested in London. Occupation? The processing officer asked. Software consultant, David replied quietly. The officer raised an eyebrow. Well-educated man like yourself, I'm surprised to see you here for something like this. David didn't know how to respond to that. He was surprised to be there too. After the initial processing, David was placed in a holding cell to wait for his interview. The cell was small and clean with a concrete bench and a metal toilet in the corner. The walls were painted a bland yellow color that was probably supposed to be calming, but just made David feel sick. He sat on the bench and put his head in his hands. His wrists were sore from the handcuffs and his head was pounding from lack of sleep and too much caffeine. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the growing realization of how badly he had messed up his life. About an hour later, a woman in a dark suit appeared at his cell door. She was carrying a briefcase and had the serious expression of someone who dealt with legal problems all day long. Good morning. I'm Jennifer Walsh, duty solicitor, she said as the guard unlocked the cell door. I've been assigned to represent you during your interview with the police. David stood up quickly. Thank you. I really need help here. This whole thing got out of hand so fast. Ms. Walsh gestured for him to sit back down and took a seat beside him on the bench. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a notepad and pen. Let's start with the basics, she said. Tell me exactly what happened this morning. David tried to explain the events leading up to the coffee incident. The lost luggage, the hotel problems, his lack of sleep, his growing frustration with the guards. As he spoke, Ms. Walsh took notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions. So you threw hot coffee directly at a royal guard's face? She asked when David finished his story. Yes, but I wasn't trying to really hurt him, David said desperately. I was just frustrated and tired. I thought it would just get his attention or something. Ms. Walsh looked up from her notes with a serious expression. I need you to understand something very clearly. What you did constitutes assault. In the UK, assault can be charged even if no physical harm occurs, but in your case, you did cause physical harm. The coffee was hot enough to cause burns to the guard's face and neck. David felt his stomach drop. Burns, is he going to be okay? According to the medical report I've just received, the guard suffered second-degree burns to his face, neck, and upper chest area. He's been taken to hospital for treatment. The room seemed to spin around David. Second-degree burns. Hospital. This wasn't just a prank that had gone wrong. He had seriously injured someone. I didn't know it would burn him that badly, David said weakly. That's not really relevant from a legal standpoint, Ms. Walsh replied. You intentionally threw hot coffee at someone. The fact that you didn't intend for it to cause severe burns doesn't change the fact that it did. She flipped to a new page in her notepad. Now let me explain what you're facing. The police are likely to charge you with assault occasioning actual bodily harm. This is a more serious charge than simple assault because of the injuries caused. David's mouth went dry. What does that mean exactly? It means you could be facing up to 5 years in prison, Ms. Walsh said matter-of-factly. 5 years? David's voice came out as a croak. For throwing coffee? For throwing hot coffee that caused second-degree burns to a member of the military while they were on duty, Ms. Walsh corrected. The courts take attacks on service members very seriously, especially when they occur at a location like Buckingham Palace. David put his head back in his hands. 5 years in prison. His job would be gone. His apartment back in Seattle would be gone. His entire life would be gone. There's more. Ms. Walsh continued. You'll also likely face charges of criminal damage for ruining the guard's uniform. Those red tunics are expensive and specially made. Plus, there could be charges related to causing a public disturbance. How much is this going to cost me? David asked. Ms. Walsh consulted her notes. The uniform alone will probably cost several £1,000s to replace. If the guard requires ongoing medical treatment or has scarring, you could be looking at significant compensation claims, plus court costs, legal fees, and potential fines. David did some quick math in his head. Even in the best-case scenario, this was going to cost him tens of thousands of dollars. Money he didn't have. What about jail time, he asked. You said up to 5 years, but what's realistic? That depends on several factors, Ms. Walsh replied. This is your first offense, which works in your favor. You're not a UK citizen, so there's no history of previous incidents. However, the severity of the injuries and the high-profile nature of the incident work against you. She paused, choosing her words carefully. If you plead guilty and show genuine remorse, you might be looking at several months in prison rather than years. But I want to be clear. Some jail time is almost certain given the circumstances. David felt like he was going to be sick. Several months in a British prison, away from his family, his job, his entire life, all because he had let his frustration get the better of him for about 10 seconds. There's something else you need to know, Ms. Walsh said quietly. This incident was recorded by multiple witnesses on their phones. The videos are already spreading on social media. By now, millions of people have probably seen what you did. David's last hope of keeping this quiet died in that moment. His friends would see it. His family would see it. His co-workers would see it. Everyone he had ever known would know that he was the person who attacked an innocent guard at Buckingham Palace. Can I call my family? David asked. Yes, you'll be allowed one phone call after the interview, Ms. Walsh replied. But I should warn you, the media is already picking up this story. Your name will probably be released to the press within the next few hours. David tried to imagine calling his parents to explain that their son was in a London jail for assaulting a soldier. His father had served in the military. His mother volunteered with veterans organizations. They had raised him to respect people in uniform, not attack them. What happens now? David asked. In a few minutes, the police will formally interview you about the incident, Ms. Walsh explained. I'll be there to advise you. But I strongly recommend that you cooperate fully and take responsibility for what you did. Trying to minimize it or make excuses will only make things worse. She closed her notepad and looked directly at David. I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Do you have any history of mental health issues? Depression, anxiety, anger management problems? David shook his head. No, nothing like that. I've never done anything like this before. I don't know what came over me. Unfortunately, that might actually work against you, Ms. Walsh said. If you had a diagnosed condition that could explain your behavior, we might be able to use that in your defense. But if you're just someone who lost control when things didn't go his way, the court is going to be less sympathetic. A guard appeared at the cell door. Time for the interview, he announced. As David stood up to follow Ms. Walsh to the interview room, he realized that his old life was officially over. Whatever happened from this point forward, he would never again be just a regular guy who had never been in trouble with the law. From now on, he would be the man who attacked a royal guard with hot coffee. And everyone would know it. While David sat in his cell waiting for the police interview, something much bigger than he could imagine was happening in the digital world. The videos taken by tourists at Buckingham Palace were spreading across the internet faster than wildfire. It started on Twitter. A tourist from Australia posted a 15-second clip with the caption, "Can't believe what I just witnessed at Buckingham Palace. American tourist throws coffee at Royal Guard. Absolutely disgusting behavior." Within minutes, the tweet had dozens of retweets and angry comments. Then someone else posted a longer video on TikTok, showing the entire incident from David approaching the guard to the moment the coffee hit the soldier's face. The video showed everything clearly. David's angry expression, the guard's pain and shock, the steam rising from the hot coffee on his uniform. The TikTok video exploded overnight. By lunchtime London time, it had over 2 million views. People were sharing it with captions like "Tourist from Hell" and "This is why." People hate Americans abroad. The comment section was filled with outrage and disgust. But it was Instagram where things really took off. A British travel influencer with 3 million followers reposted the video with a long caption about respecting local customs and military personnel. Her post got shared by dozens of other influencers, each adding their own commentary about entitled tourist behavior. Facebook groups dedicated to British military support picked up the story next. Veterans and military families shared the video with furious comments about the disrespect shown to a soldier who was simply doing his job. The groups had hundreds of thousands of members, and the story spread to every corner of the military community within hours. YouTube compilation channels started creating longer videos about the incident, adding background music and slow-motion replays of the coffee hitting the guard's face. Some channels included commentary tracks where hosts expressed their shock and anger at David's behavior. These videos were getting millions of views as people searched for more details about the story. By evening, major news outlets had picked up the story. The BBC ran a segment on their evening news with the headline, "American Tourist Arrested for Assaulting Royal Guard." CNN International covered it as a story about ugly American tourist behavior abroad. Sky News interviewed military experts who explained the historical significance of the Royal Guard and why attacks on them were taken so seriously. The story went global when it hit Reddit. The main video was posted in multiple subreddits, including r Public Freakout, r Instant Regret, and r What Could Go Wrong Here. Each post received tens of thousands of upvotes and thousands of comments. Reddit users began digging for more information about David, trying to identify him and find out more details about his background. But it was the reaction on Twitter that really showed how angry people were. The hashtag Royal Guard Assault started trending worldwide. People were sharing the video along with their own stories of military service and their disgust at David's behavior. Military families shared photos of their loved ones in uniform, talking about the respect that service members deserved. Ugly American also began trending as people from around the world shared their own stories of encounters with rude American tourists. David's incident became a symbol of everything people disliked about entitled tourist behavior. Celebrity accounts started weighing in too. A British comedian with 10 million followers posted, "Imagine being so pathetic that you attack someone who can't fight back. Hope this tourist enjoys British prison food." The tweet got retweeted over 100,000 times. American celebrities were also commenting, trying to distance themselves from David's behavior. A popular actor tweeted, "This guy doesn't represent America. Most of us know how to behave when we travel. Shameful behavior." The tweet went viral as Americans tried to push back against the stereotype that they were all rude tourists. News websites started publishing think pieces about the incident. The Psychology of Tourist Rage: Why Vacation Stress Leads to Bad Behavior appeared on several major publications. Travel blogs wrote articles about proper etiquette when visiting military sites and dealing with ceremonial guards. But perhaps the most damaging coverage came from British tabloid newspapers. The Daily Mail published David's full name, age, and hometown after obtaining information from police sources. They found his LinkedIn profile and included details about his job and education. The headline read, "Seattle software worker in Royal Guard coffee attack, inside the mind of an entitled tourist." The Sun newspaper went even further, tracking down David's neighbors in Seattle for comments about his character. They published quotes from people who barely knew him, describing him as quiet and seemed normal. The implication was clear. If a seemingly normal person could do something like this, what did that say about American tourists in general? David's employer, a mid-sized software company in Seattle, started receiving angry phone calls and emails from people who had seen the news coverage. Customers were threatening to cancel contracts if the company didn't take action against David. The company's social media accounts were flooded with comments demanding that David be fired immediately. By the time David's police interview was finished, his photograph was on the front page of several British newspapers. Security camera footage from the hotel where he was staying had been obtained by reporters showing him leaving that morning with his coffee. Even his hotel stay had become part of the story. His family back in Seattle had no idea what was happening until David's sister called to ask why reporters were calling their house. She had seen a news alert on her phone about an American tourist being arrested in London, but she never imagined it could be her brother. David's parents were at work when co-workers started showing them the viral video on their phones. His mother, who worked as a nurse, was shown the clip by a colleague who didn't realize the connection. "Can you believe this guy?" her coworker said, showing her the video of her son throwing coffee at the guard. His father learned about it when his boss called him into the office. As someone who had served in the military, David's father was particularly devastated by what his son had done. The idea that he had raised someone who would attack a soldier was almost too much to bear. David's college friends were tagging him on social media, not realizing at first that he was the person in the videos. "Dude, this guy looks exactly like you," one friend posted on Facebook, sharing the viral clip. When they realized it actually was David, the post turned from joking to shocked silence. His ex-girlfriend, who still followed him on social media, posted a long Instagram story about how she was shocked and disgusted by the behavior of someone she used to know. She didn't name David directly, but it was clear who she was talking about. Professional consequences were already starting to pile up. David's company announced on Twitter that they were investigating the situation and do not condone the behavior shown in the viral video. Industry contacts who had worked with David started distancing themselves, removing recommendations from his LinkedIn profile. The story had become so big that it was being covered on American morning shows. Talk show hosts were using David's incident as a jumping-off point for discussions about American behavior abroad and the importance of respecting other cultures. Meanwhile, support was pouring in for the injured guard. A crowdfunding page set up by military supporters had raised over £50,000 for his medical expenses and recovery. Messages of support from around the world were flooding social media, praising his professionalism and dignity in the face of the unprovoked attack. The contrast was stark, millions of people supporting and praising the guard while expressing their disgust for David. What had started as a moment of frustration in front of Buckingham Palace had turned into a global conversation about respect, military service, and tourist behavior. And David, sitting in his police cell waiting to find out his fate, had no idea that his life had already been destroyed by the very technology that had recorded his worst moment. The internet never forgets and it never forgives. His 10 seconds of poor judgment had become a permanent stain that would follow him for the rest of his life. By the time he was released from custody, David would discover that he wasn't just facing criminal charges in London. He was facing the judgment of millions of strangers who had seen his worst moment and decided exactly who he was as a person. 3 days after the incident, David was released on bail pending his court appearance. He had spent those 3 days in a fog of disbelief, trying to process what had happened to his life. But nothing could have prepared him for what he discovered when he finally got access to his phone and the internet. The first thing he saw was thousands of missed calls and messages. His phone battery had died from the constant notifications while he was in custody. When he plugged it in at the small hotel where his lawyer had arranged for him to stay, it immediately started buzzing with new alerts. His social media accounts had been found and flooded with angry messages from strangers around the world. His Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter accounts were filled with people calling him every name imaginable. They had found photos from his vacation and were mocking everything about him: his appearance, his smile, his captions about being excited to visit London. But what really shook David was when he learned about the guard he had attacked. Through news reports and social media posts, David discovered that the soldier's name was Thomas and that he was just 24 years old, only 4 years younger than David himself. Thomas had been serving as a Royal Guard for 2 years. Before that, he had completed 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan where he had served with distinction. He had joined the military straight out of school, sending most of his pay home to help support his mother and younger sister after his father died in a construction accident. The news reports included interviews with Thomas's commanding officers, who described him as an exemplary soldier who took pride in his ceremonial duties. They explained that serving as a Royal Guard was considered an honor, reserved for soldiers who had proven their dedication and professionalism. David learned that Thomas was married to his childhood sweetheart, and that they had recently welcomed their first child, a baby girl born just 3 months ago. The couple had been saving money to buy their first house, with Thomas working extra shifts whenever possible to build their savings. The medical reports that David's lawyer obtained were devastating. The coffee had caused second-degree burns across 15% of Thomas's face and neck. The burns were severe enough to require skin grafts, and doctors warned that he might have permanent scarring. The hot liquid had also damaged his eyes, though fortunately not severely enough to affect his vision permanently. What made it worse was learning about Thomas's reaction to the attack. According to witness statements and his commanding officers, Thomas had initially refused medical attention because he didn't want to abandon his post. Even with coffee burning his skin, his first concern had been fulfilling his duty to stand guard. When medics finally convinced Thomas to accept treatment, he had apologized to his sergeants for leaving his position. He was worried that his injury might reflect poorly on his unit and was concerned about letting down his fellow guards. Even in pain, his thoughts had been about responsibility and duty, concepts that seemed foreign to David as he reflected on his own selfish behavior. The fundraising campaign for Thomas had grown to over £200,000. Military families, veterans, and ordinary people from around the world were contributing to help with his medical expenses and support his young family during his recovery. The messages accompanying the donations were filled with praise for Thomas's professionalism and disgust at David's actions. David found himself reading these messages obsessively, each one making him feel worse about what he had done. This brave young man served his country with honor, and some entitled tourist attacks him for doing his job, read one typical comment. I hope this soldier knows that the whole world respects him and condemns the coward who hurt him. But it was the personal details about Thomas that really got to David. He learned that Thomas loved reading history books and had been studying for a degree in education during his off-duty hours. He wanted to become a teacher after his military service ended, specializing in helping children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Thomas coached a youth football team in his spare time, volunteering with kids from low-income families. He had been planning to take his team on a special trip to visit historical sites around London, using his knowledge as a Royal Guard to give them a unique educational experience. The attack had disrupted all of these plans. Thomas was on medical leave, unable to perform his guard duties or coach his young players. The skin grafts required multiple surgeries, and the recovery process was expected to take months. Even then, doctors weren't sure if he would be able to return to ceremonial duties, since the scarring might affect his appearance in uniform. David also learned about the impact on Thomas's family. His wife had taken time off from her job as a nurse to care for him during his recovery. With a new baby and reduced income, they were struggling financially despite the fundraising campaign. The stress of the situation was taking a toll on both of them. In one particularly devastating interview, Thomas's wife spoke to a local newspaper about the effect the attack had on her husband. He keeps apologizing to me, she said. He thinks somehow this is his fault for not seeing it coming or not being able to avoid it. I keep telling him that he did nothing wrong, that he was just doing his job. But he's struggling with guilt about leaving his post. She described how Thomas had nightmares about the incident and was reluctant to appear in public because of his visible scars. The confident, proud soldier who had served his country with distinction was now self-conscious and withdrawn. The physical scars will heal eventually, his wife continued. But I worry about the emotional scars. He loved being a Royal Guard. It was his dream job after serving in Afghanistan. Now he's not sure if he'll ever be able to do it again. Reading these interviews was torture for David. He had destroyed the career and damaged the life of someone who represented everything he himself was not. Dedicated, selfless, honorable. Thomas had spent years serving others, while David had spent 10 seconds serving only his own frustration. The contrast became even starker when David learned about Thomas's response to the fundraising campaign. Instead of keeping all the money for his own recovery, Thomas had requested that half of it be donated to a charity that supported wounded veterans. Even while dealing with his own injuries and financial stress, he was thinking about helping other people. David tried to find a way to reach out to Thomas, to apologize directly for what he had done. But Thomas's family had made it clear through their lawyer that they wanted no contact with David. They weren't interested in his apologies or explanations. They just wanted him to face the legal consequences of his actions and leave them alone to heal. This rejection was almost harder for David to bear than the legal charges he was facing. He desperately wanted to explain that he wasn't normally like this, that he was a decent person who had made a terrible mistake. But he was beginning to understand that his intentions didn't matter. What mattered was what he had done, and what he had done was unforgivable. As David sat in his hotel room, Scrolling through endless articles and social media posts about the incident, he began to truly understand the human cost of his actions. This wasn't just about his own legal troubles or damaged reputation. He had caused real, lasting harm to a good person who didn't deserve it. Thomas would carry physical and emotional scars from David's attack for the rest of his life. His young family would always remember this traumatic period. His military career might be over. His dreams of becoming a teacher might be delayed or destroyed, all because David had been tired and frustrated and had decided that his bad mood was more important than another person's well-being. For the first time since the incident, David truly understood what he had done, and for the first time he began to cry, not for himself and his ruined life, but for Thomas and the pain he had caused to someone who had done nothing wrong except stand quietly at his post, serving his country with honor. 6 months after that terrible morning at Buckingham Palace, David stood in London Crown Court wearing a suit that no longer fit him properly. He had lost weight during the months of stress and sleepless nights leading up to this moment. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and members of the public who had followed the case since it began. His lawyer had negotiated a plea agreement with the prosecution. David would plead guilty to assault occasioning actual bodily harm and criminal damage. In exchange for his guilty plea and expression of remorse, the prosecution would recommend a sentence at the lower end of the guidelines, but even the lower end meant prison time. David's lawyer had warned him to expect between 4 to 6 months in custody, followed by community service and a substantial fine. There was also the matter of compensation for Thomas, medical expenses, lost wages, and damages for pain and suffering. As David stood to enter his guilty plea, he could see Thomas sitting in the public gallery. It was the first time David had seen him since the attack, and the sight was like a punch to the stomach. Thomas's face still bore visible scars from the burns, red marks that would likely never fully fade. But despite the scarring, Thomas sat with perfect posture and dignity, wearing his dress military uniform. "How do you plead to the charge of assault occasioning actual bodily harm?" the clerk asked. "Guilty," David replied, his voice barely audible. "And to the charge of criminal damage?" "Guilty." The judge, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a stern expression, looked down at David over her reading glasses. "Before I pass sentence, I want to address you directly about the gravity of your actions." David tried to stand straighter, but his legs felt weak. "You came to this country as a tourist," the judge continued. "You were welcomed here, trusted to behave with basic human decency. Instead, you chose to assault a soldier who was performing his ceremonial duties with honor and dedication." The courtroom was completely silent except for the scratching of reporters' pens. "Your victim, Thomas Williams, is a decorated veteran who served his country in Afghanistan before taking on the prestigious role of Royal Guard. He was standing motionless, as his duty required, when you decided to attack him with scalding coffee for no other reason than your own petty frustrations." David felt tears starting to form in his eyes. "The burns you inflicted required multiple skin graft surgeries. Guardsman Williams will carry physical scars for the rest of his life, but perhaps more significantly, you damaged something that can't be repaired: his sense of security while serving his country." The judge referred to her notes. "I've read the victim impact statement submitted by Guardsman Williams. He describes how the attack affected not just him, but his wife and infant daughter. He speaks of nightmares, anxiety, and self-doubt about his ability to continue serving. You didn't just hurt one person, you hurt an entire family." David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I've also considered the broader impact of your actions. The video of your attack has been viewed millions of times worldwide. It has become a symbol of the worst kind of tourist behavior, damaging the reputation of American visitors to our country. Your 10 seconds of selfishness created lasting harm that extends far beyond your immediate victim." The judge paused, letting her words sink in. "However, I also note that you have expressed genuine remorse for your actions. Your lawyer has provided character references from family and former colleagues who describe this behavior as completely out of character for you. You have no previous criminal record and you have cooperated fully with the authorities." David held his breath, waiting for his sentence. "Taking all factors into account, I sentence you to 4 months in prison, followed by 200 hours of community service to be completed in your home country. You will also pay compensation to the victim in the amount of £25,000, plus court costs. 4 months. It could have been much worse, but it was still 4 months of his life gone. 4 months in a British prison, away from everyone and everything he knew. Additionally, the judge continued, you are banned from entering the United Kingdom for a period of 10 years. Should you attempt to return before this ban expires, you will be detained and deported immediately. 10 years. David's hopes of ever returning to make amends, to see London properly, to somehow repair the damage he had done. All of it was gone for a decade. Finally, I want to address your claim that this was merely a moment of poor judgment, brought on by fatigue and frustration. Poor judgment is forgetting to tip a waiter or being rude to a hotel clerk. What you did was a deliberate act of violence against an innocent person. The sooner you accept full responsibility for that, the sooner you can begin to truly make amends. After the sentencing, David was immediately taken into custody to begin serving his prison term. As he was led away in handcuffs, he caught one last glimpse of Thomas, who remained seated with the same dignified posture he had maintained throughout the proceedings. The 4 months in Pentonville prison were the longest months of David's life. He spent most of his time alone in a small cell, reading books from the prison library and trying to understand how he had become the kind of person who attacks innocent people. The other inmates knew what he was in for. His case had been too famous to keep secret, and many of them had no sympathy for someone who had attacked a soldier. During his time in prison, David learned that his former employer had officially terminated his employment. They issued a statement saying that his actions were incompatible with company values and that they could not continue to employ someone who had committed violent acts against military personnel. The statement went on to explain that several clients had threatened to cancel contracts if David remained with the company. His presence had become a liability that they couldn't afford. They wished him well in his future endeavors, but made it clear that he was no longer welcome at the firm he had worked for since college. David also learned that his story had become a case study in business schools and psychology courses about how stress and poor decision-making could destroy a career in seconds. His name was now permanently associated with the worst kind of tourist behavior, used as an example of what not to do when traveling abroad. When David was finally released from prison, he discovered that his apartment in Seattle had been rented to someone else. His belongings were in storage, and he owed thousands of dollars in storage fees and missed rent payments. The compensation he had been ordered to pay Thomas, combined with his legal fees and other expenses, had wiped out his savings completely. Finding new employment proved nearly impossible. Every potential employer who Googled his name found hundreds of articles about the Royal Guard incident. HR departments were reluctant to hire someone with his notoriety, worried about the potential impact on their company's reputation. The few interviews David managed to secure inevitably ended with questions about his anger management issues or his history of violence. No matter how he tried to explain that it was a single moment of poor judgment that didn't represent who he really was, employers remained skeptical. Eventually, David found work with a small IT support company that specialized in helping people who had difficulty finding employment due to criminal records. The pay was less than half of what he had earned before, and there were no benefits or opportunities for advancement. But it was work, and David was grateful for it. 3 years after the incident, David was living in a studio apartment in a rough part of Seattle, still paying off the compensation order and trying to rebuild his life. He had completed his community service requirement, working with a local veterans organization. Ironic, given what had landed him in trouble in the first place. The community service had been challenging, but educational. Working alongside veterans who had been wounded in combat gave David a deeper appreciation for military service and sacrifice. Many of the veterans he worked with had heard about his case and were initially hostile, but as he proved his commitment to helping them, some began to see his genuine remorse. One veteran, a man who had lost his leg in Iraq, eventually became something like a mentor to David. The thing about making a terrible mistake, he told David one day, is that it doesn't have to define the rest of your life. But you can't run from it or pretend it didn't happen. You have to carry it with you and let it make you better. David tried to follow that advice, but it was difficult. The internet never forgot. Videos of his attack on Thomas still circulated on social media. often resurfacing whenever there were discussions about tourist behavior or military respect. His name would always be associated with that 10-second moment when he had chosen anger over empathy. As for Thomas, David learned through news reports that he had eventually been able to return to limited duties with the Royal Guards, though the scarring on his face meant he was often assigned to positions where he wouldn't be photographed. The incident had ended his hopes of a long ceremonial career, but he had found new purpose in training younger guards and sharing his experience. Thomas had also started speaking at schools and community groups about military service and the importance of treating others with respect. He never mentioned David by name in these talks, but the message was clear.